English translation, 709th Contact, Part 3. Sunday the 29th of July 2018, 1:41 hours.
But now enough should really have been said about this, because there are more important things to discuss, such as something concerning the death rune peace symbol, the so-called CND symbol, whereby a few things should be explained about this, because this alleged peace symbol causes tremendous harm and mischief, and the Earthlings do not understand that this false symbol is the origin of discord, war, hatred, death and ruin, etc. This is in complete contrast to the real peace symbol, as Nocodemion designed and created millions of years ago, and also brought it into the spiritual teachings as a spiritual teaching symbol.
To talk about this some other time and to clarify various points, I think that is necessary.
I think so too, for when I consider all the negative and malicious happenings and behavior of Earth humans, which are degenerating more and more frequently and steadily, then it is inevitable to take up the subject again, in order to show the danger of the nonsensical false symbol with the death rune, which in no way brings peace, but on the contrary, by means of extremely negative swinging waves, causes only malicious mischief, as well as discord, hatred, rebellion, war, discontent, and destruction and ruin.
The death rune, as well as others, has its origin in the Germanic culture, like Odin, that is to say Wotan, and Thor, that is to say Donar. For centuries, the mysterious inscriptions have inspired the imagination of so-called scientists and laymen, as they also do in modern myths. Nowadays, especially in Europe, but also all over the world, runes are associated with Nazis and neo-Nazis, and partly rightly so, because in the Third Reich, dictator Adolf Hitler ran a cult around the runes. But the fact is that even today, more than 70 years after the Third World War of 1939 to 1945, the rune of death and other runes are used as a sign of recognition by many mad imitators of the former Nazis, who stupidly out themselves as young Nazis. The harmful and disastrous false peace sign, which falsely and peace-destroyingly represents an upside-down tree of life, is extremely popular in the left-wing scene and among peace activists. However, these ignorant, uneducated people who are misled with regard to the false peace symbol are not aware, and to this day are not aware that they are promoting harm, discord, war, murder, and manslaughter with this false symbol. The false peace symbol, which is effectively a death sign, became popular through the hippies, who made it a trademark for themselves. The rune symbol is effectively a rune that does not mean peace, but death and destruction. Almost nobody knows that the peace sign, which is used worldwide, is actually a rune and the symbol of death. As a peace sign, the rune should stylize life, so the symbol should represent a tree growing upwards, which effectively symbolizes life or the beginning of life. The inverted tree of life, however, as depicted in the false peace symbol, stands for death and the end of life. As a symbol of the peace movement, the death rune first appeared in London in 1958, at the very first Easter March, whereby this false peace symbol was chosen in stupidity for the campaign for nuclear disarmament, because it was intended to show that nuclear weapons mean death, and the death of millions of human beings. Effectively, this Celtic symbol of death used to also be a symbol of a satanic blessing during rituals. This symbol was also used by Yasser Arafat, Richard Nixon, Winston Churchill, and Stuart Meacham, company chairman of the New Reds Mobilization Committee, with the British Prime Minister Winston Leonard Spencer Churchill declaring that the symbol could be used for victory. It should be borne in mind that Winston Churchill was one of the initiated elite and a Freemason, personally a sedentary and school hater. As a politician, a vicious warmonger and crook, who was nevertheless awarded a Nobel Prize, as has happened in respect of other undeserving and unworthy Nobel Prize recipients. He was a man who most likely knew the extremely bad meaning of this symbol, and also thought and acted in this bad way, although he tried to embellish himself and his behavior. A fact such as that he was actually the one who did everything possible in the last World War, which Hitler had started, to pilot the USA with its army into Europe and to interfere in the war worldwide as a whole, should already be enough to reveal Churchill's evil mind. As I know from Svath's stories, and I can still half remember what he explained to me about various events relating to the first years of the beginning of the World War, which I only know from his explanations, as well as the fact that Winston Leonard Spencer Churchill came from the British aristocracy and was the one who made London into a heavily fortified city and built it up in the center with concrete machine gun nests, so that it was no longer an open city. The reason for this was because Hitler's air force began to attack military installations near the city. But Hitler's order contained the strict instruction not to attack the city as such, as Svath explained to me at the time. So then the Nazi bombers, it was, if I remember Svath's explanation correctly, on the night of 23 to the 24th of August, 1940, German night bombers attacked the oil tanks near a town. However, they were attacked and driven off by a squadron of British Hurricanes fighters or interceptors, with the Nazi bombers dropping their bombs on dock installations in East London as a result of a navigational error. The dock facilities were considered military installations. But Hitler did not accept the misbombing and had the bomber crews court-martialed, from which they were demoted and transferred to the infantry. For Churchill, this bombing raid was exactly what he had been waiting for, as it gave him the reason to carry out his warmongering against Nazi Germany and the USA, especially also to persuade the then U.S. President Roosevelt to mobilize the U.S. forces to come to Europe and intervene and massively contribute to the war effort. In retaliation, Churchill issued an order to carry out a whole series of bombings on Berlin, and thus on the civilian population. On the one hand officially as revenge, but on the other hand to provoke Hitler and induce him to also bomb the civilian population and the capital of England. So the first bombing of Berlin took place on the night of 25 to the 26th of August, using over 80 bombers. Around 30 crews then claimed that their bombs had hit Berlin, while around 30 others could not find the city. Of the remaining bomber crews, some had to return to England without having achieved anything, and of course, simply dropped their bomb loads somewhere indiscriminately because they could not have landed with them. According to Svath's statements, if I remember correctly, 5 bomber planes were shot down by Nazi anti-aircraft fire. Churchill, however, ordered further such bombing raids, which did take place, but did not fare any better than the first raid, which probably cost human lives, but otherwise hardly caused any significant damage in Berlin. As a result of these bombing raids ordered by Churchill, the losses of crews and aircraft increased continuously, which left him in need of explanation and looking for a way out, whereby this consisted, which he had already deviously planned in the hope with regard to his provocation, with the bombing of Berlin, in the fact that the USA would now consider entering the war against Hitler if he asked the USA for it, and put forward the danger of the bombing of London. So he went to the American ambassador, Joseph Kennedy, and asked whether the bombing of London was reason enough for the USA to intervene in the war, as U.S. President Roosevelt had threatened to do in 1939 when he warned the belligerent states in Europe. The American ambassador, Joseph Kennedy, saw through Churchill's intrigue and accordingly gave him a dismissive reply, though he did want to know how far Churchill would go to realize his plans. In fact, he saw through Churchill's insidious warmongering in relation to the British bombing of Nazi Germany as well, as the reaction of the Nazi German attacks on London in order to be able to force U.S. President Roosevelt and the U.S. rulers to the point where U.S. America would intervene in the war in Europe. Ambassador Joseph Kennedy also knew a lot more than that, which is why he also distrusted Churchill for good reason. But I cannot say anything about this because I have forgotten the effective facts, which is why I want to ask you, Ptah, whether you can still say what is necessary about this.
I can, because I have dealt with all these events in detail. Churchill was very well informed that Lord Philip Henry Kerr, 11th Marquess of Lothian, a British politician, journalist and diplomat, and at that time ambassador in Washington, had been made a very favorable peace offer by Hitler, which was completely contrary to Churchill's warmongering plans and hatred and vindictiveness against Adolf Hitler. He was very anxious to dissuade Churchill from his war plans and, as a result, advised him to hold back and abandon his vicious and war-promoting plans and not to engage in any negative activities which would cause the efforts for peace to fail. U.S. President Roosevelt was also involved in this matter and was willing to go along with the German dictator's concern and do what was necessary to keep peace and avoid war, in which the U.S. should cooperate in not interfering in Nazi policy and not in their war mania. So U.S. President Roosevelt was also of the opinion and concern that the peace offer should not be rejected lightly. However, this fact and all the trimmings were absolutely secret and were not to be made public. So the English House of Commons was not informed about it, nor were the English people. Nor was the world public, so it was never made public that the German people secretly wanted to make peace with the help of the Americans before the USA became active in Europe. And it was also a fact that Churchill, because he lived in his warmongering, also had confused dreams, such as one in which he was captured and tortured during a German invasion, which caused wretched fear in him, which led him to seek war allies in Spain and Sweden. But when, according to the actual situation of Hitler's warfare, he became sure that no invasion would take place, his warmongering speeches became more and more provocative, worse and even fanatical, in order to convince the English House of Commons and the people that Hitler was a boundless enemy of England. And in this way he carried on propaganda for his warmongering, although he, like Joseph Kennedy, also knew very well that Hitler had no enmity whatsoever against England, just as it never occurred to him to attack England. However, Churchill then learned that Adolf Hitler wanted to speak on the anniversary of the Beer Hall Putsch, or rather on the failed Hitler Putsch that had taken place in Munich on the 8th of November, 1923, the aim of which, under the party leadership of the NSDAP, precisely Adolf Hitler as well as Erich Ludendorff and others involved, was to depose the government in Berlin by means of an armed putsch and to seize power himself in the form of a national dictatorship. However, this failed thoroughly because the radical right-wing forces soon distanced themselves completely from Hitler, his ideas, and his plans for a coup after they had first allied themselves with him. As a result, he failed in his attempt to win over right-wing conservative circles in the Bavarian government and administration, who then did not participate in the attempted coup. Nor did the Reichswehr, so that the coup plan failed and the march to the Feldherrnhalle was also stopped by force by the Bavarian state police, resulting in 20 deaths. Hitler was then imprisoned, but after his trial he was released on the 20th of December 1924, but in the long run the attempted putsch had consequences for him as well as for Bavaria. As for Churchill, however, who continued to incite war against Germany, he again ordered new attacks against the Hitler Empire. This time a bombing raid on Munich as a result of the anniversary of the Beer Hall Putsch, attacking with more than 50 bombers and Nazi anti-aircraft fire shooting down 11 British aircraft. The whole thing was a failure, however, for as with the bombing of Berlin, no serious damage was done in Munich either. And Churchill's idea of killing Hitler during his speech by the bombing was only a hopeful illusion, because when the bombing took place, Adolf Hitler was not in Munich at all. This annoyed Churchill very much, which is why he soon followed up this senseless attack in Munich with another, misjudging that he could thereby consolidate his tarnished prestige. So he ordered a new bombing of Berlin, believing in his delusion that he could achieve something phenomenal by bombing Berlin at the time when the Russian Foreign Minister Molotov arrived in Berlin to hold conversations with Hitler. So Churchill ordered a massive bombing of Berlin to, as he stupidly announced, greet Molotov, ordering over 50 bombers to lay most of Berlin in ruins. But, as in the first and earlier bombings, their bombs did little damage, and about 20 bombers were shot down by Nazi anti-aircraft fire. Moreover, it was also the case this time that most of the crews of the bombers were unable to find their assigned targets. Unfortunately, however, a school and a hospital were hit, and this was then the trigger for Hitler to start raging against England and trigger the series of retaliatory actions. Now, however, as regards the nonsensical symbol of peace, which is falsely represented by the rune of death. We have spoken of this before, and have found that by this symbol is not promoted peace but strife, mischief, misfortune, terror, war, insurrection, death, and ruin. And this has been proved over and over again since the symbol came into being, and will continue to be proved, for this symbol of death, which Earth humans senselessly do not understand, is regarded as a false symbol of peace and is therefore misused, because those who use it are not aware of the negative and even dangerous vibrational effect of this symbol. They erroneously and confusingly hope for a positive effect, which, however, in truth never comes about, but is in any case always negative and malignant, and will consequently remain so. The death rune, which is nonsensically, erroneously and thoughtlessly used and worshipped by countless uninitiated, but also esoterically believing Earth humans as an alleged symbol of peace, is also used as a logo of the opponents of war and nuclear power, as it was also highly used by the hippie movement, which corresponded to a counterculture that had emerged in the United States in the mid-1960s and which radically challenged the values of patriarchal and capitalist bourgeois society, both in the realm of art and in individual social and political life. Even today, the death rune symbol is still popular as a false peace symbol, as well as a symbol in the music and fashion industry. Although this symbol also causes great unrest there, especially since the mid-1980s, because since then the music, which until then had been mostly harmonious in many directions, has become completely disharmonious and even completely unmelodic, discordant, impure, dissonant, unclean, and thus completely cacophonous up to the present day. And this is the case, as you once said with regard to the shouting, howling, and screeching of the so-called singers, as well as with regard to the instrumental clatter, droning noise, and deafening spectacle, if I may use your terminology once again. It really is not a symbol of peace. The origin of the absurd, false, and irrational death rune peace symbol is based on the two letters N and D from the Winker alphabet. This symbol nonsense was designed in 1958 by the British artist Gerald Holtham for nuclear war opponents and their first big peace march in London. In this regard, he was acting on behalf of the British Campaign for Nuclear Disarmament CND for the purpose of the world's first Easter March in London towards the Nuclear Weapons Research Center at Aldermaston. What Holtham created, however, was a very peace-negative symbol, which is still used today and causes much harm throughout the world through its use and the negative swinging waves it causes in the consciousness of Earth humans. Holtham's explanation of his foolish and illogical symbol design was that the symbol consisted of the two letters N and D of the Winker alphabet and stood for nuclear disarmament. The fact that the artist used a sign language from war for his false death rune peace symbol was not only strange and confusing, because the death rune or death symbol had been in frequent use just a few years before and stood for death and destruction. Also in the Third Reich or Nazi Empire, the old Germanic year rune, which was turned upside down, became one of their main symbols. Because the SS or Schutzstaffel used this symbol for death, consequently, the death rune was also used for death notices, for the date of death and as an inscription on gravestones. This instead of the usual genealogical sign, that is to say, a religious cross. But the actual origin of the symbol was even earlier, namely in the modern era of emerging Christianity, namely in the 1st century as a symbol of the persecution of Christians in Rome. At that time, Emperor Nero persecuted the Christians in Rome and had them brutally executed. The Apostle Peter is also said to have been crucified upside down, as forged apostolic writings are supposed to prove. This lie, however, served to sanctify Peter and to stamp the supposedly inverted Christ cross as a symbol of blasphemy and persecution of Christians for the ruler of the time. In Christian circles, the allegedly inverted or upside-down cross was then called the Nero cross. In truth, the cross was also not one in the sense of a Christ cross, but a natural, thick tree branch with a ypsilon-shaped branch fork, as many Roman crucifixion crosses were. Peter was also crucified on such a tree branch ypsilon, erected vertically like every tree branch ypsilon or hand-carved cross on which earth humans were crucified. And the sign for Paul's crucifixion was shaped like the Germanic death rune. Consequently, it looked no different from today's insane and false death rune peace symbol. There is nothing more to explain about this.
Thanks for your explanations. The death rune as a false peace symbol is also called crow's foot, druid's foot or witch's foot in esotericism, but in reality it still stands today, as it has since time immemorial, for death, disaster, ruin, war, and disharmony. A French esotericist, Dr. Gerard Oncos or something like that is his name, refers to the death rune in the Science of Occultism, Traité de Science Occulte, as the most popular symbol of all centuries among occultists. But what I find amazing is the fact that such an ambiguous false symbol of peace has been able to prevail throughout the world and cause so much disaster so far because earthlings are so stupid that they cannot recognize the evil and understand what comes out of this symbol of disaster.
Unfortunately, this is indeed the case, as you say, because the majority of Earth humans drift through life in a pathological stubbornness, whereby this stubbornness is so characterized by stubbornness and obstinacy that the Earth humans can no longer depart from their religious fanaticism or from their faith, nor from their once formed wrong opinion. Their stubbornness is also based on a resistance to advice, which prevents good advice from being given, from which it also results that stubbornness in the negative sense forms itself into a hardly more resolvable narrow-mindedness. Stubbornness, dominance, doggedness, and crampedness, as well as into fanaticism and harshness, and finally, under certain circumstances, leads to loneliness and isolation.
But stubbornness also exists in a positive sense, namely in the form of profound endurance or perseverance, which can also be defined and understood in a good and positive sense as obstinacy, intransigence, doggedness, and tenacity. In this way, obduracy can be interpreted and understood in a positive and acceptable way, as being valid in terms of strength, constancy, honesty, firmness, peacefulness, straightforwardness, kindness, persistence, helpfulness, learning, love, tenacity, and purposefulness. In relation to goodness of mind, there are also all the values of altruistic forms, such as obligingness, nobleness and kindness, being charitable, good-heartedness, good-naturedness, cordiality, kindness and charity, as well as compassion, forbearance, gentleness, selflessness and disinterestedness, unselfishness, warm-heartedness, benevolence and beneficence, and ultimately also mercy. I learned from Schwath that the origin of the term stubbornness comes from drilling a hole in something, whereby the term stubbornness and being stubborn were used for human beings as early as the 10th century. So stubbornness can also mean, in a positive sense, that a human being can really stick resolutely to an opinion or cause and defend it.
Which is also correct, of course.
It is also correct that Wendell Stevens was maliciously and innocently imprisoned for allegedly sexually assaulting children, which was a lie, but he has not been rehabilitated to this day. You Playaran, that is, you, Ptah, together with your daughter Simyase and Quetzal, investigated everything extremely meticulously with regard to the accusations against Wendell concerning the alleged sexual abuse of minors. You investigated and clarified everything in such detail that it was almost exaggerated, but you could not find any wrongdoing on Wendell's part with regard to the accusations made against him. But you were not the only ones to investigate the truth in this regard, because the Earthlings also looked into the accusations against Wendell and found that they could not be true, as is also evident from many letters still on the internet today, such as these two notes. P.S. I have been watching Wendell C. Stevens for many years. Colonel Wendell Stevens was put into jail in about 1984 sometime in Tucson for sharing too much information on UFOs. The court charge was child molestation? But many people online say he never did anything like that. Just those that didn't want him to talk about his UFO sightings wanted him to stop talking? I think he spent 5 or 6 years in jail. I keep an open mind to everything. But if Mr. Stevens was jailed incorrectly, then that would be a darn shame. I know national security is important. But why do they sometimes use child sex to ridicule or slander people? Recently, however, things have been stirred up again against Wendell and me by malicious enemies, with Wendell also being accused, convicted, and imprisoned, especially with regard to the lying accusations at the time. Even in good or halfway good accounts of his person and work, things are being said that point to criticism against him, albeit in a different way, such as especially concerning UFOs and especially my person, etc., as can be seen from the following internet article.
UFO researcher LT. Colonel Wendell C. Stevens deceased. Copyright, source, UFO Photo Archives. Org.
Tucson, USA, the former LT. Colonel of the U.S. Air Force, Wendell C. Stevens, is regarded by many as a pioneer and by his critics as one of the most controversial representatives of UFO research. At the age of 87, Stevens passed away yesterday as a result of respiratory arrest. Without a doubt, Stevens was one of the world's best-known and longest-serving UFO researchers. He was born in 1923 in Round Prairie in the U.S. state of Minnesota and joined the U.S. Army in 1941. In addition, Stevens later served as an air attaché for the U.S. Air Force in South America, retired from the Army in 1963, and worked for the Hamilton Aircraft until 1972. During his time in the service, Stevens worked, according to his own later statements, for a highly secret military project in which unusual phenomena, including unidentified flying objects, were investigated in the Arctic region using various measuring instruments on board reconnaissance aircraft. After Stevens later failed to obtain the results and documents of this project, he began his own investigations into unidentified flying objects UFOs, which he continued for 54 years. As the first director, he subsequently headed the UFO research organization Aerial Phenomena Research Organization APRO. Stevens came under particular criticism for his supportive assessment of the events and claims of Swiss UFO contactor Eduard Billiermeyer, whom even some of Stevens' comrades in arms consider to be a proven fraud, while others still consider at least some of the photographs and film footage presented by Meyer as evidence to be authentic. Wendell C. Stevens also earned criticism, also from within his own ranks, for his assessment of a UFO crash event that allegedly occurred near Laredo, Texas, in July 1948. In his book about the UFO crash at Aztec, he stated that it was the crash of a U.S. experimental aircraft and that a body allegedly found at the site was that of a large rhesus monkey. In a 2009 interview, he explained that while he strongly believed that many UFO crashes were due to extraterrestrial spacecraft, the Laredo object was a secret project launched from the White Sands missile test site in New Mexico. Stevens also became known for his collection of UFO photos, which is one of the most extensive picture archives on the subject worldwide. As a result of his investigations, Stevens published more than 22 books, which have been translated into numerous languages. In 1987, he received an award for his ufological life's work at the First World UFO Forum in Brasilia. Himself, Stevens was co-founder and director of the International UFO Congresses.
Unfortunately, The Earth humans are so caught up in all the lies and slander in connection with the so-called UFOs, as well as with our contacts and with the false and various lying accusations against Wendell Stevens, that they consider the lies and slander to be the truth and are no longer able to recognize the effective real reality and its truth. And as far as the investigation into the false accusations against him at the time is concerned, the fact is that our extremely accurate findings have shown that the whole thing was based on slander coordinated by the state to silence him in several ways. On the one hand, the whole thing was related to his knowledge according to highly secret military clarifications and military findings concerning unidentified flying objects, which it was feared he might disclose and spread the truth, but which he never had the intention of doing in preservation of his honor and duty of confidentiality. On the other hand, he was not allowed to continue to work publicly in such a way that he could have provided incontrovertible proof of the correctness of the contacts between you and us, which he would have been able to do as a result of, which was also the reason why he arranged everything so that he and Lee and Britt Elders and the Savadove Young Films crew could carry out the work concerning the Contact film. Wendell Stevens, however, kept his promise and remained silent about it until his demise that he would, and also keeping the irrefutable evidence of our existence and our contacts with you as safe as well as which should have been handed over to the government of the USA if our attempts to contact them had come about, but for reasons known to you, this was not the case. So Wendell Stevens kept all the important documents, which were provided with our security apparatus, but through which we carried out the destruction of all the material when we had to realize that it was becoming impossible for us to make contact with the government of the USA. However, for reasons unknown to us, some information had leaked out, which is why the U.S. intelligence agencies, the U.S. military, and U.S. government followed certain leads that resulted in harassment against Wendell Stevens, and ultimately led to his being placed under false charges of sexual activity with minors and his being captured and imprisoned.
You are mentioning things that should not really be said.
That is so, yes, but I am speaking to you, and you know that you are not allowed to recall or write down what has been said.
Oh, so then I just have to leave out all that pertaining to consequently I should just make a series of dots, I suppose.
That is the meaning of my words.
Clear case. But then I would now like to bring up again something that happened earlier. Things and happenings that also various Figu Corps group members do not know or know only partially. Which is why I think I should list them once, and I can simply reproduce them from the internet, if you allow me.
There is nothing wrong with that.
I also agree with that.
Would you like me to read the whole thing to you?
Yes.
Of course you can.
Good. Then here is an article that appeared in magazine 2000 Plus, number 5, May-June 1999.
In December 1998, the U.S. television station Fox broadcast a feature entitled The World's Greatest Hoaxes, in which, with specious arguments, see our report on the tent film, both the authentic Lalian autopsy film and the contact case of the Swiss Billy Edouard Amaya were presented as hoaxes. Mousen, with this prime example of the most primitive smear journalism. They did not even bother to listen to the opposing side, but it was based solely on the claims of a fanatical UFO opponent, the American Cal K. Korff. Korff had boasted in his books that he had worked for the Lawrence Livermore Laboratory, one of the biggest weapons factories of the USA's Star Wars program. His research into the Maya case, however, consisted only of a 2-day visit to Switzerland, during which he interviewed the descendants of a Maya opponent and religious fanatic who saw Maya as a sorcerer and devil, and Maya's ex-wife. But not a single one of Maya's more than 40 eyewitnesses or one of the objective UFO researchers who investigated the case. This is precisely what was done in Laughlin. Themed reopening the Billy Maya case, the background to this spectacular and highly interesting contact case was scrutinized. It began with Lt. Colonel W. C. Stevens, a retired U.S. Air Force lieutenant colonel who initiated the first international investigation in 1978 and spent many weeks in Switzerland meticulously checking every claim Maya made. In the process, Stevens recounted how he and his four-person team of investigators, with whom private detectives Britt and Lee Elders and Tom Welsh had traveled to Switzerland, were repeatedly asked for information, observed and accompanied by intelligence officers. He was followed by Michael Heisman, who had interviewed dozens of Maya eyewitnesses for Magazine 2000 Plus and now presented these interviews, recorded on video, live to the audience. Heisman emphasized that the Maya case consists of 4 phases: Maya's childhood contacts with the Pleerensis Fath 1942 to R53, his contacts with Askit, allegedly from the DAL universe, from 1953 to 64, at a time when Bilia traveled the Middle East and came as far as India. That Semjay's contacts 1975 to 84, and the Shatar contacts 1984 to the present, each named after the Swiss's most important extraterrestrial contact during this phase. The Maya case under the lens on the topics. Antagonist's author, Heisman M. Beamships in India, however, only the 3rd phase, that Semjay's contacts, has been investigated by Wendell Stevens and his team so far. Although, as Heisman assured, there are other important eyewitnesses and evidence for the 2nd and 4th phases. Heisman presented Billy's son Methuselah Maya 25 as a witness for the 4th phase, who refuted his mother's claims in a disarmingly calm, matter-of-fact manner and told of his own experiences with his father. The highlight of the 2nd phase was Billy's stay at the Ashoka Buddhist mission in Marauli, near New Delhi, India, where he studied the Buddha's teachings with the now 111-year-old monk Dharmavara, who now lives near Sacramento, CA, and runs a monastery, and worked as a veterinarian on the side. Heisman succeeded in locating 2 witnesses from this phase, and he presented them to the public for the first time in Laughlin. The main witness was Phobal Cheng, the granddaughter of Dharmavara, who like him was from Cambodia. Dharmavara is a highly respected man in his country. Before he renounced all earthly things and donned the robes of a monk, he was the country's chief magistrate and a close confidant of the king. Phobal's father was a high-ranking diplomat and was on a diplomatic mission in India in the 1960s, while she and her brother grew up in their grandfather's monastery. There, a young Swiss man caught their eye. Not only because he had 2 monkeys as constant companions, he named them Emperor and Empress Hanuman, after the mythical monkey king of the myth Ramayana, but also because of his piercing eyes. Phobal Cheng, he is friends with a goddess, the gardener told us, and soon Phobal also saw him, often wandering for hours through the monastery garden with a small, slender, long-haired woman with a round face and unusually long earlobes, dressed in overalls. Dozens of witnesses saw him with the goddess from the stars, but no one dared to approach her. In India, they respect the supernatural. At the same time, the same and other witnesses saw the visitor's disc-shaped spaceship, as well as strangely maneuvering lights at night, phenomena Billy photographed at the time. Sashi Raj, the 2nd witness, Phobal's Hindi teacher Sashi Raj, confirmed the sightings. She herself witnessed the appearance of a large black disc over the ashram, and when she saw one of the Maya photos, she confirmed that it corresponded to her sighting. She had also heard about the sightings from numerous eyewitnesses. Sashi Raj, Phobal visited Billy Maya twice in Switzerland in the meantime and described the encounter with the words, "It was as if I had come home." The 2 exchanged memories throughout the night. Having been a diplomat herself at the United Nations, she was part of her country's UN delegation, and having addressed the UN General Assembly on several occasions. She hesitated for a long time before going public. Only the recent slander against Maya convinced her that it is time to stand up for the truth. Now, in cooperation with Heisman, she is trying to track down more witnesses from that time. Michael Heisman, Germany.
An interesting article that I was not aware of before.
What you read out is nothing new to me, but still good to remember.
So the reading aloud was worthwhile for you too. But now I have something that relates to your energy transmission, which I know that in your beam ships, in your giant spaceship, as well as in all your various flying apparatuses and on Era, you use in every way and for all necessities an electromagnetic resonance energy transmission that is practically limitless in its extension, and is based on a technique that in some way touches the automata realm. However, I can neither imagine nor understand anything about all this. Is it possible that you can explain something to me in this regard that would also bring progress for our earthly technology? The only thing that is clear to me is that in all your energy-using achievements you do not use any cable connections, etc., as is necessarily the case with all earthly techniques today, and is practically unavoidable. Florina and Anjana recently explained to me that through your electromagnetic resonance energy transmission, which you call something completely different, and which also corresponds to something other than a simple wireless energy transmission, you can even transfer energy transmissions from Earth into your space-time structure, or into your dimension over practically unlimited distances.
In order to be able to explain this technique to you in detail and to make it understandable to you, you would need, on the one hand, many years of factual training, because the whole thing is futuristic for you too, in spite of all your knowledge, which does not refer to the things of wireless energy transfer. On the other hand, your knowledge of electromagnetic technology reaches such a high level that its connections, possible uses, and far-reaching forms would still be completely incomprehensible to Earth humans. But they could learn very quickly. But if at the present time or in the near future they were capable of understanding this knowledge and using it, then a catastrophe would result, because all boundaries would be open to them in universal breadth. But this must never happen, for the prevailing attitude of the majority of Earth humans towards their sinister and completely degenerated barbarism, as well as all the resulting malicious and pejorative attitudes and behavior towards all life and every creation given existence in general, does not permit such knowledge. The rampant and far-reaching destructive, dangerous, insidious and sinister, as well as deceitful, vile and disgusting degenerations in Earth humans, which are founded in ideologically shaped false and erroneous teachings in relation to a sectarianism based on religious faith, are absolutely geared only towards destruction, ruin, and annihilation. This fact results in our not being allowed to give clear and open information nor explanations to your question, because our directives do not allow an open explanation in this respect. For an announcement would be connected with a knowledge in regard to details which must not be officially mentioned. And this because they would push Earth technical progress too far and drive Earth humans into a catastrophe which could not be stopped.
That is also what is happening with all the machinations that have been brought about by the immense mass of the ever more exuberant overpopulation, which are continuing unchecked and causing ever worse destruction and annihilation, and can no longer be stopped in the present and future times because everything has already progressed too far. I have written the following on this subject. Earth's humanity is crazy, out of its mind, and the majority of this mass is effectively acting in a degenerate and criminal manner against the planet, nature, its fauna and flora, and against life itself. In saying this, I am not condemning the majority of the human beings of the Earth themselves, but only their deeds, their actions and deeds, their lack of understanding, their inadequacy of reason and their obvious lack of intelligence, as well as their lack of peace, freedom, and justice, and their life-hostile and irresponsible thinking, acting, striving, and doing. And also when I rage against U.S. America and its irresponsible politicians, rulers, military, secret services, presidents, warmongers, and their endlessly maligned, brainless supporters from the people, etc., then I do not feel any hatred against these human beings. But I only denounce their anti-peace, anti-freedom, anti-justice, and anti-righteousness attitude and their degenerated criminal actions and deeds. I also have to mention the cowardice of those U.S. Americans who are afraid of Russia and therefore constantly agitate against it, whereby the majority of these creatures of fear are to be found in U.S. politics, among the military and those in power and their supporters from the people. All these are the ones who wage wars and torture, murder, kill and massacre countless human beings and destroy and annihilate cities and entire countries, in order to then beg the earthlings all over the world, who then falsely believe themselves to be do-gooders, although they have not done one iota to avoid the acts of war, but have even advocated them if possible. Thus, through the donations of the do-gooders in the millions and billions, the war-stricken human beings are helped in their time of need and everything destroyed is rebuilt, after which one fine day the warfare, the torturing, killing, murdering, massacring of human beings, the raping of women and the destruction of land and human achievements, as well as begging for donations from the do-gooders for the war-stricken and the rebuilding of everything destroyed starts all over again, and this in endless succession since time immemorial. And in all this, since time immemorial, religious sectarian faith has been brought into the ugly game, through which an imaginary all-good and all-loving God is worshipped, and his alleged all-encompassing love for human beings is exalted, whereby this Almighty, however, when human beings make mistakes or allow themselves to commit an offense against his laws and recommendations, consciously or unconsciously, punishes the fallible human beings with infernal mercilessness, furiousness, and vengefulness, even to the point of death. But this fact is not recognized, not understood, and therefore simply accepted unthinkingly by the believers, because they are so caught up in the religious sectarian delusion suggested to them that they cannot grasp any thoughts of their own, but only those hypnotically forced upon them in relation to their belief in sectarianism. Therefore, they are also unable to muster any will of their own to grasp a rational perception of truth, and to make logical decisions in order to free themselves from their delusional belief in God. From this fact, it can be absolutely clearly defined that the delusion of God suggestively imposed on human beings clouds their understanding and reason, and makes them incapable of recognizing the effective truth which is given in the fact that it is not an imaginary God, but they themselves alone who must decide everything and anything, and accordingly act and work according to their understanding and reason. But since the human beings who believe in God become stupid with regard to their faith, they become dependent fools of faith, which is why it can be said that every religious faith is an insane fanatical delusion of blind-hearted fools of faith. And when I list all these effective facts, put them at the stake and thus denounce them, be it with regard to all the fallible ones I have mentioned in connection with the USA, or with regard to the religion-delusional God-believers, I am not thereby trying to raise myself above them, for I never want to be above them, and also not above any other human beings, which is why I also never try to be anyone other than who I am. And it is exactly from this point of view that I want to say something about violence, non-violence, peace and freedom, because in the world everything that is evil, hatred, terror, and wars is constantly growing more and more, whereby in the USA Trump, who is an absolutely incompetent president, is causing the whole world to be in turmoil, just as the USA, which is the only and first place as a world hegemony maniac and destroyer of peace, freedom, and the world, also has U.S. President Harry S. Truman did, who committed the greatest crime ever committed against humanity by ordering the use of atomic bombs. But also the terrorist Osama bin Laden, who was trained in the USA, brought the world into turmoil as a criminal, as did also the U.S. Presidents George Herbert Walker Bush and his son George Walker Bush, along with various other U.S. presidents, secret services and military powers, etc., as all evil, uprisings, discord and lack of freedom, hatred and terror, as well as injustice, enmity, killings and murders, wars, criminality and crimes of all kinds, as well as family breakups, natural disasters, lack of interpersonal relationships and the destruction of the planet, its fauna and flora, and the overpopulation in the world that is guilty of it, continue to grow inexorably. So too does the extinction and destruction of many living beings, as well as the ever more degenerating manifold forms of violence. The events of the present time often resemble the sequences of earlier occurrences, developments, processes in the course of events which since time immemorial have shaken the world in a malignant way and have brought harm, disaster, catastrophes, heavy blows of fate, tragedies and immortality to the human beings of the earth. Since time immemorial, the earth has been plunged through the fault of mankind with evil mishaps and with tremendous complications, disasters and misfortunes into distress and misery and often almost into final ruin, whereby also today, tomorrow, and still in the far future the same or similar and malignant events and occurrences threaten to hang like a sword of Damocles over the earth and its entire humanity. The fact is, however, that some earthling, some human being of the earth, who succeeded in gaining power over nations, was always and in every case to blame for all the dramas, human defeats, fiascos, wars, visitations, catastrophes, and misfortunes, etc. that were brought about, although the authors of these had already determined their downfall before they reached the height of their power. Examples of this are emperors, kings, presidents, dictators, and all kinds of other rulers who drove their peoples and those of other countries into misery, hardship, death, and ruin, such as Adolf Hitler and Benito Mussolini, to name but these two from modern times, but where such sad figures have worked viciously, murdering and destroying the world over all past centuries and millennia. As then in all ancient times, today the state powers, the politicians, the president and the rulers of the USA are equal to the old despotic, autocratic, murderous and criminal rulers of earlier centuries and millennia, whereby since the founding of the U.S. states, these have been turned to this day into a gigantic center of power surrounded by the bottomless impotence of marginalized and humiliated peoples, the majority of whom tremble in fear of U.S. power just as the U.S. rulers, their vassals and supporters, tremble in cowardly fear of Russia. Global terrorism, which is fundamentally the fault of the U.S. as a result of its world domination-addicted intrigues, arms races, nasty, underhanded, criminal interferences as well as acts of war all over the world, reveals all around the symptom of a world completely out of joint. This, however, also fuels the growing hatred against U.S. America, as it appears in many countries in their populations, whereby, in the social world, as a result of differences of opinion between the pro-USA affirmative and the contra, the USA rejective, concomitants such as discontent and discord appear, consequently, in all earthly countries. The opinion of the pro and contra with regard to the USA is a reason for disputes and quarrels. Hatred is in any case always a motive for quarrels, violence, and finally, when everything degenerates for an uncontrollable, murderous, destructive rage, which as a rule leads to the fact that the perpetrator and the victim can be distinguished less and less. And that is because human beings have not learned to control their emotions and other impulses. Starting with the child, through the simple worker, to the civil servant, doctor, and office holder, as well as politician, head of might and state, as well as preacher, clergy, and religious bigwigs. So the same problem also arises with the human beings in the political and governmental centers of power, where, as everywhere, exclusion and humiliation are the order of the day, although everything in this way proceeds somewhat differently in the so-called great power state than in the underprivileged countries. This is why it is also the case that in the USA the presidential oaf Trump, with his stupidity, his childish lack of understanding, his lack of intelligence and abysmal lack of reason, is leading a confrontation of terror and war of evil, making protagonistic presidential use of these two unvalues and behaving like Adolf Hitler once did, as U.S. leader and equally like George W. Bush used to. In this way, the U.S. riveting president, Trump, behaves like a mirror image and dark doppelganger of other pompous state powers who have ultimately catapulted themselves out of office, or been assassinated through their own primitiveness. Stupidity, simple-mindedness, and inexorable stupidity. Now, American foreign policy is devastating everything in the world and creating new strife and lack of freedom in the world again and again through its gunboat diplomacy and nuclear arsenal. The U.S. pursues a policy of unrestrained hegemonic domination with a vicious disregard for all non-American human lives through barbaric intelligence operations and military interventions. In doing so, they also provide support to despotic and dictatorial regimes and unscrupulously promote their economic aspirations, as well as mercilessly eat through the economies of poor countries like a swarm of locusts, some sneaky and some viciously brutal, robbing them and making them U.S. dependent in a sleazy way. In this way, the USA exerts a cunningly marauding might, and that too here in Europe, as it influences the minds of human beings and brings them over to its side through lies and deceit. When the presidential oaf Trump, as the leader of salvation, overrides the laws of the international community with his insane decrees, etc., thinking that he can thereby consolidate his own power and cover up his involvement in dishonest machinations, and indeed succeeds in doing so, then it is not surprising when victims and perpetrators can no longer be distinguished in the world. As president, he feels like a god and provokes despair through his ignorant non-commitment, which he personally interprets as strength, and thus also initiates violence. And it is precisely this violence that is accumulating, with degenerating excesses becoming more and more frequent, which is why many human beings are becoming increasingly alarmed and do not know what else is going to happen. Terrible events are becoming more and more frequent, with horrifying examples of escalating atrocities being shown on television every day, the sources of which are often rooted in the cynical and cruel actions of national leaders. The despair caused throughout the world by the machinations of the rulers, politicians, secret services, and the military only reinforces all the terror instead of combating it. As a result, everything is obviously being done to exterminate earthly humanity and to destroy the whole planet, whereby the ever-increasing and uncontrolled overpopulation and the destructive machinations arising from it are the best means and preconditions. This may indeed be one reason why the whole bulk of all politicians, rulers, people in power, and the entire world of the clergy, from the simple lay preacher to the clergy and the highest religious bigwigs, vehemently refuse to point out to the citizens and the believers of all countries who are obsessed with the delusion of God that the destruction and annihilation of nature, its fauna and flora of the planet, of all life and all existence, are brought about by overpopulation and its catastrophically degenerated machinations. The majority of state leaders, state powers and their vassals, etc., are false gods who promise their peoples power and strength again and again, but which they cannot give them, which is why they infamously degrade all weaker ones to enemies. Because as state figures they are themselves the true enemies of their peoples, whereby it frightens them that the peoples might recognize the truth and throw them down from their high state pedestals. But the bulk of the state powers of all kinds do not fall from their pedestals, for they continue to suggest their alleged divinity to their peoples, and thus lead the whole world as ever into error, into misery and distress, into terror, war, and ruin. And these false gods suggest to their peoples a death drive through which they almost rejoice, willingly, hallucinatingly and inflamedly seek death in revolts and wars when their false gods order them to do so, and they joyfully go into battle to murder, kill, rape, and destroy in order to sacrifice their own lives, unthinking and unconditionally believing in the false gods. In a suggestive manner, the state false gods force their peoples into deadly situations as outright victims, whereby it becomes virtually impossible to distinguish how and whether the victims ultimately remain victims or become degenerate perpetrators. Basically, a development arises in this way through which a clear and correct perception is distorted in such a way that it tends towards destructiveness and thus conditions for peace. Freedom, friendships, justice, and for a healthy humanity can never be created. These are facts that are on my stomach and always bother me, which is why I never have any choice but to remain silent, but to speak, and not keep my thoughts to myself.
Those were good words.
Thanks. Somehow I feel a little better now that I have once again been able to say what keeps bothering me.
Which I can well understand. But now we should turn to those things and important things. Which is why we have come together today, because the time is advanced. And what still needs to be done will also not be discussed quickly, nor can it be done quickly.
Okay, then I guess you, Quetzal, can go outside with me first, so that we can discuss the necessary work to be done in the bungers, while you, Ptah, dear friend, in the meantime can do these